Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's session. My name's Kendra Bosworth for the people that don't know me, and I'm the Manager of Learning Development at ACSL. I'll be facilitating this session. If you have any questions, need any support, please reach out to either myself or Tanya, who's also here from ACSL, through the chat. Thank you, Tanya. Please reach out if you've got any questions. What we're going to do is have a few welcomes and introductions, and then Archbishop Emeritus Mark will actually take over. We will have questions at the end. If you have a question, can you put the questions into the chat so that at the end we can field them to him in the right order? Thank you. So if we start with a prayer. In the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Amen. Gracious God, provide us with a listening heart so we may see and hear the voice of children and adults at risk. May our organisations, authorities and families listen to, respect and do what is required to keep children and adults at risk safe. We ask you to help each of us to exercise our duties with compassion, integrity and clarity as we work together to enact real change and uphold the safety of all who come in contact with our church and communities. Amen. Amen. Thank you. I recognise that I am facilitating this session from the Gundungurra country and the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you're all joining from today. We honour the First Nations peoples, culture and connection to land, sea and community, and we pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. ACSL also acknowledges the lifelong trauma of abuse victims and survivors and their families. The failure of the Catholic Church to protect, believe and respond justly to children and adults at risk, and the consequent breaches of community trust. So please be aware that very obliquely, this session discusses abuse and therefore may contain content that you find confronting. If you do start to feel distress, please use your own judgment and ensure you're safe. You can find the resources and support resources on the ACSL website. But today I am pleased to introduce our presenter, Archbishop Emeritus Mark Coleridge. His Grace retired at the beginning of September after leading the Archbishop of Brisbane for 13 years. It sounds like he's still got a very exciting life going on from what he's just said, but Archbishop Mark was ordained a priest at St Patrick's Cathedral, Melbourne in May 1974. After ordination, he worked as an assistant priest in various Melbourne parishes before studying sacred scripture at the Pontifical Biblical Institute. After 4 years in Rome and Jerusalem, he returned to Melbourne to teach scripture, and in 1997 he was invited to work in the Vatican Secretariat of State. He returned to Australia as auxiliary bishop for Melbourne in 2002 and became Archbishop of Canberra and Goulburn in 2006. On the 2nd of April 2012, His Grace was appointed Metropolitan Archbishop of Brisbane, leading the province of Queensland. In reflecting on his 5 decades as a priest and a bishop, His Grace has noted that almost nothing had turned out as he expected. Jesus often surprises, but he never disappoints. Archbishop Emeritus Mark will present with no slides, and afterwards we will welcome questions and comments. But as I said before, while he's talking, if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to add them to the chat, and I will ask you to speak to the question at the end of the presentation. With all that being said, I really want to say thank you and welcome to Archbishop Mark.
Thank you very much indeed, Kendra, and good to be with you all, even if it is through a screen darkly. I was thinking earlier that if you live long enough, and I'm in that category, you eventually become the keeper of the common memory or the teller of the story. So what I offer here this morning in the time given to me is really autobiography. But I do so on the understanding that my story is in some sense our story. And that was the title that was given to me, Our Safeguarding, not mine. But it is my story on that understanding that in telling my tale, I am in fact speaking about the story of the church, I think. Now, the first thing I would say is that in my years of seminary training, I never once heard a mention of sexual abuse or any of the matters that we come now to call safeguarding. It simply wasn't mentioned. But this was typical of the society more generally, where there was a great silence that gathered around what was an appallingly widespread phenomenon we came later to see. So that's the first thing. There was a great silence, not only in the seminary, but in the culture. Now, my first experience, I suppose you'd say, of sexual abuse, the first time I even heard about it, certainly in the church, was in 1977, when Michael Glennon was first charged. He was charged many, many times in subsequent years, but the first time he was charged was 1977. And I can remember that I and many others had a sense of disbelief. This couldn't be possible, that a priest would abuse young people on the scale that was alleged of Michael Glennon. Now, I suppose in a deeper or darker moment, I thought to myself, well, Michael Glennon was always extremely unusual and, frankly, I thought mad in the seminary, very gifted, but an extraordinary psyche. I thought if it was going to be done, it could only be done by someone like him. But then at a gathering of the clergy, I can still remember that Father Frank Richards, who was a remarkable figure, had been one of the rats of Tobruk, got up and delivered a most impassioned defence of Michael Glennon and saying how outrageous this was, this persecution not only of a priest, but of the Catholic Church. And what Frank Richards said at that large gathering of clergy was greeted with thunderous applause. So that was a widely shared sense of things at that time. So I'm back in the late 70s. Now, in the meantime, other cases began to emerge. So it clearly, but it was only a trickle at this stage. It would become a torrent later on. But it was obviously not just someone as unusual and perhaps as deranged as Michael Glennon. So that began to sow the seeds of doubt, leading to the sense that disbelief was just not an appropriate response at all. But nonetheless, what prevailed for quite some time in my memory was denial, that this could not happen in the Catholic Church. This could not happen in the life of a Catholic priest. So the whole spirit of denial was an extraordinarily powerful thing and very hard to shake. In time, it gave way to a kind of minimalisation. This was, again, as more evidence of abuse emerged. When I say minimalisation, well, it's there, but you know, it's a fairly minor thing. At this stage, of course, all the focus was upon the priest. The victim was neither seen nor heard, and that was crucial. So denial in that sense gave way to a kind of minimalisation that was accompanied by defensiveness, that this was an attack upon the Catholic Church, an attack upon the priesthood. So disbelief, denial, minimalisation, and defensiveness were absolutely typical, I think, through the 1980s. However, by the time we'd got to the 1990s, and again, as more and more evidence came to light and the great silence was beginning to be shattered, the Church had to respond in some very practical way. And therefore, in the 1990s, you eventually had the emergence of the protocols. Well, the bishops, who were extraordinarily slow to move on this, but they eventually decided that they had to put together a protocol that would become towards healing. Now, in the meantime, Archbishop George Pell, as he then was, had become Archbishop of Melbourne. And when he became Archbishop, Jeff Kennett, the then Premier, said to him, you'd better do something about all this, and if you don't, I will. So the pressure was on George Pell, but George was also a man who tended to go his own way and who had a rather ambivalent attitude towards the Australian Bishops' Conference. So eventually what emerged before Towards Healing was the so-called Melbourne response, which had its strengths and weaknesses. Now, this infuriated people like Bishop Jeff Robinson, who was the prime architect of the Towards Healing protocol. So, but at least by the mid-1990s, you had these protocols that recognised that there was a problem and that the church couldn't just sit back and do nothing, look the other way, which had been the tendency. It was at about this time that I was asked to serve as the spokesman for the church in Melbourne. I was an academic at the time, teaching biblical studies at the Theological College, but because the church was under such enormous pressure from the media, they felt they needed a spokesman, and for better or worse, I was the one chosen. Now, I can put words together, I always could. But when I look back on some of the things I said and did in those years that I served as spokesman for the church in Melbourne, dealing mostly with sexual abuse, I cringe, honestly. Things I said I would never dream of saying now, and things that I did I would never dream of doing now. But that was where we were. So it wasn't just me and my gauche handling of these extraordinarily sensitive matters. It was where the church was. Now, eventually, by 1997, I was asked by George Pell, in fact, to do a stint in the Secretariat of State of the Vatican. This came totally out of the blue. I was the master of the Theological College. I was teaching biblical studies. I was the spokesman for the church in Melbourne. So it wasn't as if I was a spare part. I had a very full book in Melbourne. So the request to do this stint in Rome really did come as a shock to me. And my initial instinct was just to say, no, I've got far too much on the go here in Melbourne. But anyway, I went through a whole process of discernment through a period of about 6 months, so that by the end of 1997, I was in Rome and in the Vatican. Now, that was a fascinating insight into the way the church beyond Australia was responding to what was coming to the surface in many parts of the world, largely in the Anglophone sphere. And there was a tendency in Rome, this was a very powerful tendency, to say that this was an Anglophone problem, which is patent nonsense, of course. The fact is, I can now see, or we can now see, is that sexual abuse is everywhere. And people who say it's not are living in a fantasy world. Different cultures, however, address it differently. For instance, in Italy, if a priest was in court charged with the abuse of children, it would be reported in fairly undramatic terms on about page 10 of the newspaper. It wasn't big news. Now, in Australia, as most of us perhaps would know, it was very far from that. It was front page news and relentless attention to abuse in the Catholic Church particularly. But that was not so in Rome. So the spirit of trying to isolate the phenomenon, say it's only in the English-speaking world, and therefore a general sense of denial. It's not our problem. In fact, in Rome, the attitude was, it's up to the bishops to deal with the problem, not the Holy See. Because in general, in Rome, the Holy See only intervenes locally if it perceives that the bishops are failing. Otherwise, they pull their head in and step back and allow the bishops to do what is really their job. So it's only once there is this perception that the bishops have failed that Rome will intervene. Now, eventually, that was the situation that emerged, particularly in the USA. Australia was a long way away, and we're small fry in the views of the Vatican. But once it began to emerge as it did, particularly, say, in Boston, in the USA, the Holy See began to get very interested because it began to touch not just bishops, but cardinals like Bernard Law of Boston. Eventually, this led to the decision by a very aging and rather frail Pope John Paul to summon a meeting of the American cardinals in early 2002. I remember it well because I was intensely involved in the preparation for that meeting. But that was the first time that Rome recognised that, first of all, the scale of the problem and the failure of the bishops to address the problem. So that meeting was held, and it was, by the way, during that meeting that I was asked to be bishop. So it was all happening in my own life at the time. But at least the meeting of the American cardinals signalled that Rome recognised there was a problem. In other words, denial wasn't an adequate response, as the evidence kept mounting dramatically. In fact, by this time, we'd entered the new millennium. So I returned to Melbourne as an auxiliary bishop in 2002, and it was as a bishop that I had a totally new experience of dealing not just with abuse, but with victims. And this, for me, was the crucial turning point. I have to say that my memory is that when I was an auxiliary bishop of Melbourne, I don't remember sexual abuse being mentioned at any time at our curia meetings. Now, the curia meetings were the meetings of the Archbishop with the auxiliary bishops and certain other decision makers in the diocese, which were held every week. They were important meetings, but I may be wrong, but I have no memory of sexual abuse being mentioned. And again, there was this sense of the cone of silence. And this was said in the time of Archbishop Little as well, that he never mentioned it to anyone. I mean, it's extraordinary when you think about it. But he might have talked to other bishops. I don't even know that. But certainly there was no discussion at the level of the decision makers of the diocese of what was going on. And that itself was part of the problem. In general, I think my impression in Melbourne when I was an auxiliary bishop was that we had to just batten down the hatches, wait for the storm to pass, and then get back to business as usual. It was a hope, looking at it now, of course, it looks a hopelessly benighted attitude. But that was a powerful sense that this would pass, batten down the hatches, it will pass, and we'll get back to business as usual. Now, it was at about this time that I began meeting with individual victims. When I was the spokesman for the church in Melbourne, I had been part of an ill-fated large meeting of victims and their advocates that was held at the Knox Centre in East Melbourne. I was very uneasy about this meeting, and it turned out to be an absolute disaster. The level of anger, I mean, this was true of meeting victims generally. It was a quality of anger that I had never known before. It came at you or me like a tidal wave, and it was very hard to know how to respond to it. Certainly at this large meeting at the Knox Centre, there was a level of anger that really led to the point where the meeting got out of hand. It was a meeting that was planned and proposed by someone who was leading the response to abuse in the diocese, not a bishop, but it was very ill-conceived. So what I discovered there was you can do the right thing, or seemingly the right thing, with the best of intentions, but it turns out to be absolutely the wrong thing in this area. But it wasn't until I sat down as a bishop, face to face with victims. It began as a trickle in my 4 years as auxiliary bishop of Melbourne, But it really gained momentum when I went to Canberra as Archbishop, because it was there that I had to sit down a number of times with victims of abuse and simply cop this volcanic anger, and simply listen to it. And it wasn't targeted at me personally, but I represented the church, and I had to accept that. And this is where I learned to distinguish between culpability and responsibility. I wasn't culpable for the abuse. I hadn't done it. But as a bishop, I was responsible for doing something about the damage it had caused. So for me to see that that distinction between culpability and responsibility was both essential and liberating. Eventually, because of these encounters with victims and their advocates, I decided to write a long pastoral letter that turned out to be quite important, not just for me, but for others as well. It was called Seeing the Faces, Hearing the Voices. And one of the things I said in that long pastoral letter was, until you have seen the faces and heard the voices and sat across the table and copped the anger, you don't know what you're dealing with, you don't know what you're talking about. And I could see that that was the situation of just about everyone in the Vatican. These were not bad people. Au contraire, at times, there were some extraordinary people there, but they had never met a victim. So my experience was, until you do meet a victim, and not just one, but a number, because everyone has their own story, although there are extraordinary points of convergence in all the stories, you can't understand what you're dealing with, and therefore can't respond. One of the things it showed me was that the defensiveness of any kind is simply self-defeating. It's a form of suicide. I also came to see that the victims and their advocates are not the enemy. They've been treated as the enemy. They're out to get us. This was, in fact, not only absurd, but dangerous. They weren't our enemy, they were ours. And that's a huge sort of somersault once you see that. Once you start seeing things from their point of view, once you start hearing voices through their ears, the world changes. And one of the changes, as I say, was that I came to see that the victims and their advocates and their families were not the enemy, nor were the media. Now, this was another big point, because I'd had to deal with the media extensively as spokesman. But there was a general perception in the church that, oh no, the media were out to get us. They're our enemy. In fact, the media, far from, I mean, they could do some shocking things, as we all know, but far from being our enemy, they were on our side, but we didn't know it. I mean, we were our own worst enemy, I suppose, is what I'm saying. The other thing was that we tended for a very long time to talk as if it was just a case of rotten apples. There were some rotten apples in the church, but by and large, get rid of the rotten apples and all the other apples will be fine. What I came to see, and it took me years to see this, but I can see it with brilliant clarity now, and I could some years ago. The problem, to call it that, the problem was in fact cultural. It was structural. And that made it much more difficult to tackle. But at least we saw the truth. It wasn't just a matter of rotten apples. It was somehow cultural and structural in a way that involved the whole church. Clergy certainly, religious certainly, but a third of the abuse had been committed by lay people. But the whole church was somehow caught up in this, without realising it perhaps, this cultural or structural situation which was at the heart of the problem. And you could change all the policies and all the protocols you like, but if you didn't change the culture, there was every likelihood that the same thing would recur, and it has. So the challenge I came to see, and it's daunting, but at least it's liberating to see the truth. The challenge is to change to change the culture. And that's not just clerical culture, that's part of it, but it's church culture. And this is where I think part of the providence of God is what Pope Francis came to call synodality. I presume many of you, most of you, all of you perhaps, saw that film Spotlight. Now, I went to see it with a great sense of apprehension. I was a bit reluctant to see it, but I thought I'd better see it. So I went to see Spotlight, which was about Boston, you remember. And to me, it was hugely illuminating because it wasn't just about the Catholic Church. It was about what was called in the film the village. At one stage, the cardinal law figure said to the new editor of the Boston Globe, "Welcome to the village." And it was about the village. In other words, that the whole village was somehow complicit in what was going on. The epicenter was the Catholic Church and Catholic clergy, but the Boston Globe itself was complicit for a long time. Again, the cone of silence. So I came to that sense of the Catholic Church also as the village, and asked myself, therefore, what can we do to change the culture of the village? I mean, I think of that saying, it takes a village, the whole village to raise a child. It can take a whole village to abuse a child and to cover up the abuse. I mean, you need to fine-tune that, but clericalism began to be identified as somehow at the heart of the problem, and that was all about power, really. And that goes to the heart of culture. Clericalism is simply ordained ministry geared not to service but to power. You need to say a lot more than that, but that's where it starts. So again, slowly, there was this kind of painfully slow awakening to try and just to see the truth of things and to see through the eyes of the victims and to hear through their ears. It was incredibly hard, and when I look back now, I'm embarrassed at how slow it was. But you've got to live with the embarrassment, because in all of this there was a grand humiliation. But there was providence in that too, because again, Pope Francis has made the point a number of times that true humility can only come via humiliations. And we have been humiliated. When I say we, the Catholic Church, I'll say more of this when I speak in a moment about the Royal Commission. We have been hugely humiliated, but that's not without its grace. And in fact, I think all the churches, frankly, have been humiliated. And someone recently spoke of the ecumenism of humiliation. See, we, the Catholic Church, we were a proud church. We were the strong, successful, proud church. And when we were humbled to the dust. But again, there is a grace in that. It's an unwelcome and rather painful grace, but grace is like that sometimes. Now, when I went to Brisbane, again, it was another dimension. First of all, because Brisbane's so much bigger than anything I'd known before, but also because of the scale of abuse in Brisbane. And the way in which it was addressed, it was a shambles. It was bad enough in Canberra, but Canberra was small scale. Brisbane was big scale, the second biggest diocese in Australia. And the way in which it had been addressed was totally shambolic. Basically, Archbishop Battersby, a great friend of mine and a wonderful man, but he didn't want to know about it. And he wanted Bishop John Gerry, one of the auxiliaries, to deal with it. But John Gerry was in retirement mode. and had run out of puff. So by the time I got there, I could see it was a shambles. And then the Royal Commission was convened at about the same time. I came to Brisbane, the Royal Commission was convened, and Pope Francis was elected at about the same time. So again, it was all happening. But once the Royal Commission was announced, we had to go through the files, and there was stuff all over the place, and a lot of stuff wasn't there. So again, there was that sense of it being a shambles. But even to come to see that and to try and get some order into the chaos was itself a grace of a kind. Not only did I have to try and deal with the situation in Brisbane, but I was also elected as one of the bishops to sit on the bishop to sit on the Truth, Justice and Healing Council, which was the body gathered together to manage the church's engagement with the Royal Commission. That was an extraordinary experience, and again, a journey of awakening. And I appeared 4 times before the Royal Commission, and I can tell you now, if you've never done it, it's a very intimidating experience. Even the physical setup of the hearing room was quite intimidating, and I'm not easily intimidated in a public setting of that kind, but it was very intimidating. And I tried to speak the truth, but in such a situation, inevitably you misspeak or you forget. I was trying to remember things back in the 70s and 80s, and that's extremely difficult to do when 2015 or whatever it was. So the Truth, Justice and Healing Council initially was chaired by Justice Barry O'Keefe, who was a remarkable figure, but Barry died about 6 months into the whole journey. And then it was Justice Neville Owen from Perth who took over as chair and did a remarkable job. It wasn't the easiest of tasks, and it wasn't the easiest of bodies to manage, I have to say. There are some strong personalities and different views on all kinds of things, that particularly the figure of Francis Sullivan. I was strongly supportive of Francis Sullivan to be appointed as the executive officer of the Truth, Justice and Healing Council, and I think he did a most magnificent job under the greatest pressure and at great personal cost. Very few, and I'm one of them, know what it cost Francis Sullivan personally to do what he did through those years of the Royal Commission. You'll remember that at first it was going to be a Royal Commission into the Catholic Church, but there were protests about that, and rightly so. That wasn't just defensiveness, that was justice. So eventually the Gillard government decided to make it an inquiry into institutional responses by all kinds of institutions, though in the end, notably, the government was fairly well exempt from the kind of scrutiny that the churches and other bodies had. Eventually, the report from the commission was submitted to the government, and we were asked formally to respond. When I say we, the bishops and the major superiors were asked to respond formally to these recommendations, and that was quite a task. Now, by this stage, I'd been elected president of the Bishops' Conference, so it wasn't the easiest of times to be in that position, I have to say. So by the time we finalised our official responses to the recommendations of the Royal Commission, I was president of the conference, and Monica Kavanagh was the president of CRA. So we had to front this massive media conference here at Mary MacKillop Place, where I am this morning. And again, that was pretty grueling. It wasn't much different from being fronting the Royal Commission itself. But we made a response which we felt was in touch with the reality of things, in touch with the truth, and trying to do justice to everyone, which is extremely hard. Now, some of the media figures were relentless and obsessive, I think, which is not to say that they were our enemy, but it was pretty grueling. In all of this, I have to say, as president of the conference, we were not helped by the attitude of the then nuncio, who tended to minimalise the whole situation. I don't know whether it was his own point of view or whether he was acting on instructions from the Holy See, but he tended to say at bishops' meetings, well, I think you're overreacting. Just get on with things. It is an important issue, but it's only one issue. But in fact, it was much more than one issue if it touched upon the whole question of church culture. So again, I think a minimalising approach at that time was not at all helpful. Now, eventually, Pope Francis convened a meeting of the presidents of bishops' conferences, and I was one of them, in Rome in 2019. And we had it was an extraordinary gathering for many reasons. There were victims there, just by the way, which was extraordinarily important. But to my surprise, I was asked to give the homily at the final mass, which was celebrated in what's called the Sala Regia, just near the Sistine Chapel. It's an extraordinary room with great big frescoes full of papal triumphs and the Battle of Lepanto and the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre and images of power left, right and centre. Well, here I was standing up in front of all these presidents of conferences in the presence of the Pope, holding forth from the pulpit. Well, my memory, I don't have the text in front of me, but I remember it well because what I focused upon was power and the misuse of power. And I pointed to these images of power in the Sala Regia. So there's power for you of the papacy. Now, how do we use power? Is it to create? Is it the power of God, in the end, the power of love? Or is it demonic? Is it the power to destroy, such as we've seen through the drama of sexual abuse? The other point that I tried to make in the homily was we are called to undergo a Copernican revolution. Now, Copernicus, you remember, said that the sun doesn't revolve around the earth revolves around the sun. What I meant when I said this in the homily was we revolve around the victims. We say the crucified is at the heart of all things. Stat crux dum volvita urbis, but the cross is the still point of the world. The victims are the crucified, surely. So that far from seeing the victims and their advocates and families as being somehow marginal and revolving around us, we have to turn that on its head, a la Copernicus, and see them at the centre because they're the crucified and us revolving around them. Again, you see things and hear things through their eyes and ears, and that's when you begin to get the Copernican revolution. I was also, having been a member of the National Committee for Professional Standards as the bishop member, I was then one of the bishop members of CPSL, which was founded in the wake of the Royal Commission, and eventually it gave way to ACSL, and I don't think I was formally on ACSL at any point, but I was on everything else. Then, of course, we had the drama of the collapse of CCI. Well, I could talk for hours about that, but this is not the time or place. But just when you think things couldn't get any worse, they did with the collapse of the insurer. Anyway, we've made adjustments as best we could in the wake of that unforeseen drama. In some ways, it should never have happened. But again, it was a failure to understand the scale and the nature of what we were dealing with. So I asked myself, is there an end in sight? I don't think so. If it is about the change of culture, it's slow and it's going to take a long time. So I can't see an end in sight. That doesn't mean to say it's hopeless. We've come an awfully long way. I mean, I've just touched on the mountaintops of my own journey, but it suggests that we have come a long way in a few decades, but we've got a hell of a long way to go. Let me just conclude by saying, as I look back, I'm astonished the way the whole thing of abuse has overtaken my life and my ministry as both priest and certainly as bishop. I never saw that coming stupidly, but I didn't. I've known nothing as corrosive of faith as this, and it corrodes at a deep, deep level. And I ask myself, what toll has it taken on me and on others, on everyone? But the bishops, for instance, it's destroyed some of the bishops. I could mention a few names: Phil Wilson, Bill Wright, Michael Malone, Ron Mulkerns. I could go on. These were men who, in one way or another, I think, were destroyed by what was going on. They were crushed. So who are the victims? Well, first of all, the abused, of course, first among the faithful. But then I'm left thinking that in some ways we're all victims. Now, that doesn't minimise anything and doesn't take the focus away from those who have been actually abused. But the whole church community in some ways is victimised or has been victimised by this. As a bishop, trying to do justice to everyone is terribly difficult. With abusive clergy, trying to be their brother or their father, but having to be their judge as well. That's extraordinarily difficult to negotiate. And I could go on, but justice has to be done to everyone. How to balance crime and punishment on the one hand and sin and forgiveness on the other. See, we treated it as a matter of sin and forgiveness for a long time. We were very slow to see it in terms of crime and punishment, but somehow the two had to be held together. We misunderstood the pathology, perhaps we still do. We were too trusting, perhaps, in psychologists, lawyers, insurers, because we, the bishops, were like rabbits caught in a headlight. We didn't know what to do, if the truth be told. So we tended to trust in those we thought did know, like psychologists, like lawyers, like insurers, when in fact we needed to intervene precisely as bishops, but we didn't know how. And then more generally, one of the things I thought in the Bishops' Conference before I retired was we have been very slow to recognise the colossal scale of our corporate failure. Again, the pressure of minimalisation. And as long as that persists, look at all that happened in the past and look at all the good things we're doing now. Now, there's truth in both of those, but neither of them or the two together are not the whole truth. So I don't think this is behind us in any way at all. I am not at all hopeless. On the contrary, there have been astonishing, if unwelcome, graces on the whole journey, the gifts of God and acts of divine providence that none of us saw coming. And it's when you look at those that I think you recognise that the journey that has begun will, in some sense, come to a good end. So let me come to a good end and return to silence and pass back to you, Kendra. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you so much, Archbishop Mark. That was really generous of you to provide your reactions and your thoughts. I really appreciate that. There are a number of questions in the chat, which I will go through if you don't mind.
Fine.
But I really want to start with a thank you, and quite a few of the things in the chat coming through a thank you. The aim of today's session was to learn from the past and to understand the past so that we can continue to improve. So I'm glad that you're not feeling hopeless. I'm glad that there is some hope for the future, given what a horrid past we have had, but it will take a long time. So the very first question came from Father Justin Glynn, who said, "Thank you for this. You described the Knox meeting as both ill-conceived and a turning point in your understanding of the issue. How would you organise a meeting or meetings between church authorities or others and victims in a way that incorporated the learnings without replicating the problems?"
Yeah, that's a good question, Justin. Look, the problem, as I saw it at the time and see it more clearly now, was having a big crowd together. I don't think there's any value in having a meeting of that kind. A big crowd of victims and their advocates feeding off the anger of each other and creating a crescendo, therefore, of wrath. That doesn't really help anyone. It doesn't help the victims. It doesn't help anyone. Therefore, the only meetings that I have found valuable are one-to-one, where you don't say much at all, but you try and listen, which can be hard enough. Now, the popes have had meetings with groups of victims. I've never done that, but I presume the difficulty for the Pope is that he can't meet individuals just in terms of his diary. But I wouldn't favour that necessarily either. I honestly think that part of the dynamic of healing has to be, I sit down with you, you speak, you're in charge, I listen, and I respond eventually as best I can. And so that's I would not, even though I'm retired now, but I would not agree to meet with a group of victims, I think, and I certainly wouldn't agree to do what we did at the Knox Centre, and that is to meet with a large number of victims and their advocates. I think that would probably be counterproductive in any situation I could imagine.
Thank you for that.
The awakening for me was to see, for the first time in that meeting, the volcanic nature of the anger. As I said in my words, it was a quality of anger I had never, ever seen in my life.
Thank you. The next comment was from Ursula, who says, thank you for these important insights. You spoke about the grace of humiliation. Do you think as a church we are successfully rebuilding trust?
At rebuilding trust, did you say? Well,
yes.
Look, until we do build trust, I'm not sure we can ever go back to where we were. This is where rebuild and those sorts of words leave me uncomfortable. We're not looking to restore something. We have to build something new. But one of the reasons why all our apologies fail to land, I think, is because we're not trusted. And how many apologies have we or I made over the years? Their name is Legion. But then we're accused of never having apologised. Well, but what it says is that apologies haven't landed because I think trust is not there. Now, there's no quick way to build trust after what we've been through. I think the only way to build trust, certainly not spin, but it is to do what has to be done and to do it as well as possible and over quite a long period of time. Now, it's not as if trust hasn't been lost on every front. For instance, our schools, by and large, are still trusted. The bishops, I think, have lost trust on a massive scale, and perhaps the clergy and the religious, although religious women, I think, are still trusted mightily, and rightly so. So look, and our services, social welfare and healthcare are certainly trusted. So if you look across the board, there hasn't been a total loss of trust in the Catholic Church and Catholic institutions, but at certain points it's quite dramatic. But there's no quick fix. And I think the only way is to build a new kind of trust by doing what we have to do, however painful and costly, over a period of time.
Thank you. I'm flipping to another one from Ursula, which was, do you have any thoughts about what will happen post the closure of the redress scheme?
Well, I don't know. I suspect it may be, and Ursula would probably know more about this than I. Um, can you hear that mower in the background? Well, I
Not at all.
can.
Not at all.
Um, it always happens, does it not? Look, I suspect that the redress scheme will be extended. I and many others have serious problems about the redress scheme. Again, it was well intentioned, but you don't right one injustice by creating another. And I think there are serious elements of injustice in the redress scheme. The bar is fatally low, and all kinds of awards are made against people who have no right of reply, and many of whom are deeply, deeply aggrieved and sometimes permanently wounded by the allegation made against them. Now, I have expressed my hesitations, my doubts about the current form of the scheme to key parliamentarians who are involved in its oversight, but nothing has changed. The problem is, of course, as the church or as a church leader, we're in a very weak position because, again, if we start criticising the redress scheme publicly, we look as if yet again we're ducking for cover. But that isn't the issue in this case. I think it really is that there are injustices inbuilt into the current scheme. Now, if it is to be extended, I would like to think that some of those injustices, dare we call them imperfections, might be addressed, but I'm not confident on that front. But if the scheme does stop, it'll first of all, it'll cut off a lot of these fraudulent claims because this is a new phase of the journey. We're getting, when I say we, across the board, not just the Catholic Church or even the churches, there are any number of patently fraudulent claims coming, many of them from prisons. And I'm told that some of the people in our prisons say this is their superannuation. In other words, you can make any claim against any Catholic priest, just pick one, doesn't matter, and you'll get something. And of course, the lawyers aren't averse to this at times either. Here in Queensland, or there in Queensland, they have passed legislation sensibly so that law firms can't trawl through prisons, as it were, looking for business. So that is a problem. What to do about these fraudulent claims? And once upon a time, we didn't believe, early on, we didn't believe victims. We thought they were making it up. They weren't. Then we went through another phase of saying we've always got to believe the victims, which was a much saner approach to things. But now you see we're in another phase where you can't necessarily believe what is alleged. And in that sense, fraudulent claims do an injustice to those who really have been abused because it casts a certain element of doubt upon all claims. So I don't know. I'd be interested to hear from others like Ursula what they think might happen if the redress scheme does come to its end.
Thank you. Ursula, would you like to reply?
Just briefly, thank you for those reflections, Archbishop Mark. It's always wonderful to hear and put into context, the journey that the church has been on since those early days. In terms of the redress scheme, I don't think it's going to be extended at this stage because I think that it's not only the Catholic Church that's been having to deal with dubious complaints and allegations and the claim farming that's rife now has got out of control. And recently the New South Wales government actually fined a legal firm for actually going in and doing that work and clawed back quite significant amounts of money. But I do wonder, we don't have towards healing anymore. We we have the National Response Protocol.
Yeah.
Is that protocol, do you think, going to be sufficient to, with victims and survivors and their families, when the redress scheme is gone, what needs to be in place then for the church to be able to respond compassionately and in a trauma-informed way? Do you think the NRP is enough, or do we need some other strategy to be in place by 2028?
Yeah, look, I think that's a very real question. How do we do justice to victims and their families after the redress scheme? Well, there are in Queensland there are the PIPA claims, but that's a very clumsy legal process that you wouldn't wish on anyone, frankly. I don't know, so I think the question's very real, and I think we as a church need to look at it. I don't know that anyone has. When does the redress scheme finish? It was 10 years, wasn't it?
Yes, so the last claims will be accepted up until October 2027, so that they can all be managed by the end of the scheme in 2028.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, well, all I can say is that question that you've raised is a very important one, because the redress scheme can come to an end, but the cry for justice continues, obviously.
Exactly.
And
good question, that one.
Can I just add to that there is Father Justin's also added that the critique of the redress scheme also applies to some extent to the National Response Protocol, which in places conflates civil, canonical and criminal standards of proof. He doesn't know how the quest for the Vatican Recognito is going. So thank you, Father Justin, for that comment. There was one last question in the chat that we haven't got to from Tim, which is, within churches, there's sometimes such an emphasis on the welfare of an alleged abuser. How can we shift this towards more of a focus on the big picture, impact on victims and safety of the vulnerable? And Archbishop Mark, if you want to respond very, very quickly, and then we will wind up.
Kendra, I'm struggling to hear you. I'm sorry.
Okay.
The volume on this computer is very poor. I don't know how to change that. Could you just?
I'll speak up and I'll try and articulate a bit better as
I'm
well.
sorry about this, but
My apologies.
Particularly with this mower going in the background.
Okay. Tim Ross has said, within churches, there's sometimes such an emphasis on the welfare of an alleged abuser. How can we shift this towards more of a focus on the big picture, impact on victims and safety of the vulnerable?
No, I'm sorry, I missed it again.
That's okay. You know
I apologise for this, but it's not my computer. I've sought to raise the volume, but I just have drawn a blank.
Can I give my apologies then to Tim for not getting to your question? I think that during your speech, Archbishop Mark, you talked a little bit more about what we should be doing for victims and survivors. So thank you very much for that. I am also aware that you are rushing off to another event, so I do want to finish it up. I want to say thank you so much for joining us and sharing these insights today. We really appreciate it. It will help support us and help work out and develop our responses for the future in safeguarding. So thank you so much for your time and good luck in your retirement. I know it's not the end of seeing you. It's going to be really wonderful to see the next future and where you head. So thank you very much. And thank you to everyone who attended. You will receive a link to the recording in the next couple of days. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Kendra, for the invitation to be part of this, and every good wish and blessing to all of you, because what you are doing goes to the heart of who and what we are as the church. So thank you very much for everything, and for this moment to be with you. Thank you also.
Thank you, and goodbye, everyone.